Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Byrne, and I am the Executive Director of Freak Film Festival. I am here to welcome you to our conversation about the documentary Coded Bias. We're going to have a really great talk for you tonight. It's going to feature Detroit author and organizer Tawana Petty, Clare Garvie, who is a privacy and technology expert, and Nancy Kaffer, who is a free press opinion columnist who always has great thoughts and very much connection to the conversation that's happening in and around Detroit. If you're not familiar with Freak Film Festival, I'll tell you just a little bit about what we are. We are the documentary-focused festival produced by the Detroit Free Press Newsroom and its Michigan and its business arm, Michigan.com. We've been around for 7 years now. We had big plans for a physical festival that would have happened in April 2020. Of course, the pandemic had other plans for us. So instead, we're doing the virtual thing here in December, and we're super glad that you are here and part of it. We have 5 films that are screening these next 5 days. That's Wednesday through Sunday, December 2nd through December 6th. Coded Bias is one of them. We've also got a lineup of some other really cool films. If you have some interest, I'll encourage you to check out freakfilmfestival.com. That's our website. You'll find trailers, synopses, and all sorts of information, including ticket buying links if you're interested in seeing some other films. And of course, if you're watching this conversation before you have seen Coded Bias, I encourage you to check it out. It's a film that myself and our artistic director, Kathy Kielishevsky, saw at Sundance 2020 earlier this year. That was January. Feels like ages and ages ago. When we walked out, we were both just like, we have to get this film for Freak Film Festival. So we're so excited that we have it. Along with the film screenings, we do conversations with every film we've booked. Those are watchable 2 different ways. One, of course, you're here live now, most likely, and that's one way to do it. They'll also be archived in 2 places. If you buy the film screening, it will be attached right there, and also at the Free Film Festival YouTube page. That's really all I need to say now. I want to get to our panelists. I will mention as I hand it off to Nancy Kaffer. She was a longtime colleague of mine at the Free Press. She's a brilliant person. I'm really looking forward to see what her take is on this movie and also the ongoing conversation that's going on in Detroit about the technology that is really talked about in this film. So for now, I will hand it to Nancy, and I'm just going to kick back and listen with the rest of you. And I hope to see you at other Free Film Festival conversations, and I hope you check out our films as well. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Steve. I'm not muted.
You're unmuted now.
You missed me saying that was far too kind, that introduction. You're very
Not
generous
sure
with your compliments. See, this guy. And I am going to welcome 2 women to this panel tonight. I'm so excited to be in this conversation with 2 women who are brilliant, resolute, incredibly informed. We're so lucky to have them to have this conversation about Coded Bias, a fantastic documentary that has relevance for all of us, but especially, like Steve said, for us here in Detroit, facial recognition has been an issue. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our panelists and we're going to get the conversation started. We have Tawana Petty, who is the National Organizing Director at Data for Black Lives, a group that aims to pair data and activism for greater accountability. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Tawana. She is expert on all this technology and the way that it can be used and misused, and I can't wait to ask her questions. Also joining us is Clare Garvie of Georgetown Law School Center for Privacy and Technology. She's a senior associate there, and she is a favorite source of Detroit journalists who want to talk about facial recognition technology and its use in our city, because she is an absolute expert in this field. So thank you both so much for taking time out of your Wednesday evening to be here and talk about this. I know most of the people with us, I hope have seen the movie. For those who haven't, it's a really deep exploration of how bias is loaded into the algorithms that govern so much of our lives, which is bad. But then also this sort of machine decision making is often presented as infallible and unbiased. Because it's a machine making a decision about whether to extend someone credit or how to identify someone in a picture. But it's about brilliant data scientists who explored the data that went into facial recognition identity, for example, identification, and found that bias was sort of built into it because pictures of white men had been used to teach a computer how to recognize faces, and found that's why these programs are so bad at not recognizing Black and brown Americans and misidentifying them. So if you haven't seen the movie, I strongly encourage you to, because it's fantastic. So there's so many things to talk about. In the movie, I was really struck by the activists from Great Britain who talked about the network of 6 million surveillance cameras that they have there. We're not used to that kind of surveillance in the United States generally, but in downtown Detroit, we have a lot of cameras that are set up by private security companies. And this is an interesting question. I've spent a lot of time trying to kind of unpack how those cameras are being used, whether facial recognition technology is being used. We know the Detroit Police Department uses facial recognition technology, and that they're able to use it on images from those private cameras that film what happens in public spaces, even if there's not live facial recognition technology. So I guess, Tawana, do you want to start with, I'd love to, there's so many problems with this that it's kind of hard to figure out where to start. But can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this and what your primary concerns are? I know there's a long list, but yeah. And I'm hoping we're going to get a lot of questions from the audience. So folks, if you want to put questions out, Steve and Kathy we'll get to them. We want to have a dynamic conversation here. But Tawana, if you can start talking about that a little bit to get us going.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. And I'm glad you mentioned the private, security companies that are also using, these. Actually, they were using these mass surveillance systems in downtown prior to Detroit Police having Project Greenlight, and Detroit Police was using those cameras as well. So ultimately, they're all being used for to be leveraged by law enforcement and what I would argue government institutions. And so I started to get involved in the idea around surveilling Detroiters through the organization Our Data Bodies, which I co-founded with several other organizers across the U.S., mainly in Charlotte and L.A. We have an organizer in Cape Town, South Africa, and one in London. And all of us were engaging with community members and asking them about the ways that their information was shared, collected, and stored, and what impact it had on their ability to make livelihood or not. And there was a running theme across all the communities that they felt like they were watched, but they weren't seen, that their information was being leveraged to their detriment and not their benefit, that corporations and law enforcement and other entities were extracting all this information, including biometrics, to make decisions about them. But then when it was time for them to access information for their own benefit, they could barely get information about city services, about, their own histories, and things like that. And so there was just this running notion from community members that there was a data trail or a stream of information that was affecting their lives. And so that was about 2015, 2016. And as I was doing that research work with Our Data Bodies, which I was serving as a researcher through Detroit Community, through Detroit Community Technology Project, Project Greenlight was ramping up at the same time. And it had started off as, 8 or 9 cameras at gas stations that were going to be open late. And now we fast forward to 2020 and we're at over 2,800 Project Greenlight cameras. And we've since learned about face recognition, thanks to Clare Garvie and their incredible work. And so we were against the notion of mass surveillance because we knew about the social credits. At this point, we had learned about the social credit system and how if you're hyper surveilled and massively surveilled by a system that is already in many ways racially biased, that it's going to have an impact on the ways that it controls you. And that was without even knowing that face recognition was a component of that. And so I'll stop there for now.
Claire, one of the things that you and I have talked about when we've spoken is, and it was definitely a big theme in Coded Bias, is the way that regulation and accountability lags the use of the technology. And we saw that here in Detroit when the police department rolled out facial recognition technology for, I think, 18 months without having a public hearing about it, without having a publicly approved standard operating policy in place. We've talked about this is a big theme of this type of technology. Yeah, is that it tends to get implemented before we really have a opportunity to get our arms around it.
That's right. When I first started looking into the acquisition and deployment of face recognition by law enforcement in the U.S., what we found is, first of all, we had no idea how widespread it was used. It really wasn't talked about in city council meetings or in legislative hearings or anything like that. And yet we found that about a quarter of all law enforcement agencies, of which we have 18,000 across the country, have access to one of these systems, probably a lot more. We found that over half of all American adults are in a face recognition database that's accessible for use by law enforcement, and none of us had any idea. So yes, the rule rather than the exception is that the technology is purchased and deployed without any sort of public engagement, and often without the legislature even having any idea that the technology is used. Detroit's a good example of, or a bad example of this. We found when I was looking at the extent to which real-time face surveillance or face recognition off of live face recognition cameras is being used, we found that Detroit had purchased this system. It was in the contract, it was $1 million contract with a company called DataWorks Plus, and there was no policy, and there was just no data beyond what the company actually had put out in the contracting process. And in that contracting process, they also said, oh, by the way, we also sold this system to Chicago. I've been FOIAing Chicago Police Department for years and never came across any information about the fact that they had the same surveillance system. So in doing further digging, we realized, yes, massive system designed to be deployed in conjunction with Project Greenlight cameras, which initially, as Tawana was saying, we're focusing on stores that were open late night, gas stations and whatnot, but had very quickly expanded to public housing projects, women's health centers, standalone pharmacies, churches, schools, exactly the places that you do not want surveillance, particularly biometric surveillance, being able to record where you are at any point in time. And then what happened was, again, pretty typical, where the first policy that was put in place, it wasn't a rule put in place by the legislature. It was a policy put in place by the Detroit Police Department that said, okay, we have a policy, and we're going to use this system on any video that we have available to us now and in the future. That was their first policy that said, hey, we reserve the right to use this in any way, shape, or form that we want. That has since been shut down, thanks to, in very large part, the work of Tawana and community members who have just so consistently called into city council meetings and board of police commissioners meetings and said, we do not want this in our city.
If I look out my upstairs window, I can see a green light flashing on the apartment building around the corner from me. I think it's just a regular apartment building. I don't know why it would. Anyway, so yeah, it really is everywhere here. One of the things that I thought also was interesting about coded bias, and that you and I talked about in the past, was that when governments adopt this technology, even if they're slow to bring it to the public, there are mechanisms for public input and public accountability in government. But when it's a private company, like Facebook or Amazon, that have built out a lot of this facial recognition or algorithmic infrastructure, and are using it extensively, or for example, here in Detroit, where the Illich company that owns the hockey team and the baseball team uses facial recognition in its broad camera system in their sports arena areas, there is no mechanism for public accountability when it's a private company. How do we create or force, I guess, public input into those closed processes. Either one who wants to hop in on that. From the legal analysis angle or the activism angle, whoever wants to go.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. It's a really good question, and it's really tough. With the exception of Illinois and Texas, there actually aren't robust laws protecting our biometric information, and it's used by private companies. The strongest law in the country around this is the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois, but anyone who's outside of that is pretty much up a creek when it comes to this kind of thing. The companies that are developing the face recognition system sold to law enforcement, fortunately, generally have less access to our photographs. The way this technology has become really powerful in the hands of law enforcement is access to our DMV data, our DMV and passports and mugshots. But that said, we now have a company called Clearview AI that has claims they have scraped 3 billion images off of the internet of all of us and have made that into a database that they're selling to law enforcement and still private security as well. They claim that it's just law enforcement, but they very clearly sell to private security. So yeah, unfortunately it's a huge problem, and with the exception of Illinois, it's pretty much a Wild West.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, and Portland is probably is like the only place who's now, you know, issued a ban on public and private use of face recognition technology, private and government use of face recognition technology. And so, you know, the hope is that we can get those sorts of regulations in place here as well. I think it's really going to take federal legislation. You know, there are a lot of folks who have put policy out there. You know, rest in peace, State Rep Isaac Robinson in Michigan. He had put forward a 5-year moratorium, which would have issued a ban on all of the use of face recognition, but then he died of COVID. And so, you know, that's another thing, is we're in a situation in Detroit where poverty is drastically increasing rapidly. I mean, it was $29,000 a year was the median income prior to COVID-19. Since then, 40% of the residents have lost their jobs, and we're steadily ramping up mass surveillance systems and other ways to criminalize the public. And I think that is something that we have to lift up, is that even if these algorithms are fixed, what is the impact going to be on community members who are out here trying to figure out how to survive? And so, yeah, we need federal legislation. We need to, you know, there are ongoing efforts to try and amend the city's charter to try and get some efforts in place. A community input over government surveillance ordinance is up to try to get community members' voices into the room so that they can at least have input on how this surveillance technology is deployed. And in Detroit, is you know, a lot of folks don't know, not only do we have face recognition and Project Greenlight, but now we're going to have ShotSpotter, which captures audio and deploys officers into like a 6-mile radius, which it could end up not being a gunshot at all. And so all these folks are going to have law enforcement looking for someone who shot a gun, who may not have shot a gun. And it also captures audio. We have drones. I see them on a number of occasions just looking outside my window. We have surveillance helicopters. We have cell phone tracking. Like, there's a lot of biometric surveillance in the city of Detroit that a lot of folks should be giving pause to. And then I'll finally say, as Claire said, the DMV records, like a lot of times when something's happening to Detroit, you know, folks kind of just sit back and go, oh, that's a Detroit issue. But if you've taken a state ID in the state of Michigan since 1999, you are in that database. And that's why Robert Williams was picked up, a misidentification in Farmington Hills, because he was in that system. And they used the grainy video image to try to match, and it picked up him and mistakenly identified him. And so there's a lot to be concerned about with these technologies.
So one of the things that's challenging about this, though, is I wrote a couple years ago, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, because time flies. I wrote a piece about the extensive private camera network throughout downtown. It's very hard to find out information about. I actually wound up finding out how many cameras were owned by the Quicken company, which is a major company, major property owner in downtown Detroit. They've got cameras in all their buildings. And I found out how many cameras they have because I ran across a job posting online that said, seeking someone to monitor a network of blah, blah, blah cameras. But they wouldn't tell me, which is part of the problem, because private companies don't have to answer a journalist question. So I wrote this piece about how this, we have private security and private cameras, in our public spaces of our downtown. And I got a lot of pushback. I got pushback from friends, from readers, from friends who are pretty progressive and young, and readers across the spectrum saying, what's wrong with you? Why don't you want to help fight crime? That, we want the city to be safer. I wonder if you encounter that type of pushback, Tawana, and how you talk to people about why this isn't necessarily keeping us safer, even if it seems like maybe a good deal.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Of course, all day long in my DMs on social media and to my face in public meetings. And I'm glad you brought up Quicken, right? I was just reflecting yesterday on the fact that, Gilbert had a real-time sort of surveillance system before DPD, before Detroit Police Department had one. And they were in the media at that time, really championing the fact that, or getting before cameras and saying, like, we really want to use a system like this. We hope we get a system like Quicken has a system, and so he's heavily influenced the fact that we have these real-time crime surveillance systems. But that was, that was back in like 2013, right? And I don't have to tell you that as poverty has increased in the city and opportunities have declined, that crime has not reduced. And so now we have thousands upon thousands of surveillance cameras and all sorts of surveillance technology, and crime is not reduced. And so I'm a Detroiter as well, and I'd like to be safe in my city. But we know that those are not the things that create safety. And we've had almost a decade to experiment in this direction. And so it's time that we take some of these millions of dollars that are being spent on surveillance technology and we invest in mental health support. We invest in recreation centers in the neighborhoods. We make sure that grocery stores are walkable in communities. We make sure that there are things for young people to do. We do the things that make sure that families are fed and that quality of life issues do not create quality of life crime. And so, this is not a justification for the harms that are happening, but it makes sense if you think about it. Any living being, if their back is against the wall and they're starving, they're going to figure out how to eat, and sometimes not in the most humane ways. And so we know what makes us safe. All we have to do is go 15 minutes outside of Detroit and look at resourced neighborhoods and see how those are drastically different with regard to safety. And you won't see flashing green lights in those communities. You'll see grocery stores and adequate schools and adequate housing and just the things that it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure that out.
Claire, so a couple of years ago, several reporters and I were given a tour of the Real-Time Crime Center at Detroit Police Department, where they were showing us how they use facial recognition software in an attempt to kind of quell the firestorm of negative attention that had erupted around this. And they showed us a very methodical and meticulous process where they ran a picture against the Michigan Department of Corrections database, the DMV. They've got a bunch of hits that didn't work, and then they kind of methodically winnowed it down. They found a picture on Facebook, which is another thing that I think that people should be aware of, is that they can use facial recognition on any photo. And so if you have a publicly posted picture on Facebook, that's fair game, apparently. So, this very careful process reviewed by multiple supervisors before a warrant could be issued for the suspect. And as a journalist, I, of course, am always suspicious of everything. And I wonder if you ever read, because I know you follow this stuff nationally, how often this very careful, methodical process is followed versus maybe a process such as what we saw with Mr. Williams, who was falsely identified with facial recognition in Detroit. It does not seem to have been such a methodical process. It seems like they, on very little evidence, decided that he was the man in the photo and went out to get him. Which end of this is most common or most accurately?
Yeah, so that's the funny thing. I would actually say they were probably the exact same process. And here's why I say that. So the Robert Williams case, basically this individual was misidentified using face recognition. The department that ran the face recognition search was the Michigan State Police. Of all the agencies that I have surveyed and interviewed and gotten records from, Michigan State Police and the FBI are the ones that probably have the most rigorous standards in place to avoid misidentification, by which I mean they require training for the individuals who run these searches, and I'll get back to that in a second. And they require a double-blind search. Basically, two people have to run the exact same search and agree that there is a possible match before what's considered an investigative lead is sent back to the officer. So assuming that, and on paper, it appears that all of that was followed for the Robert Williams case, and it was not enough to prevent Mr. Williams from being misidentified and arrested for a crime he didn't commit. So I would contend that if it looks really careful, we have to drill down a little bit on that. Face recognition is a biometric identification technique. It's considered an imperfect one. It runs the risk of error. But in that framing, it's a forensic technique. We've all watched CSI and I don't know, the Chicago PD show, which is, they all need to be indicted, but that's a conversation for a different day maybe. But face recognition in many ways looks like a fingerprint search, a latent fingerprint search. We have a latent face left on a camera that's then run against a database of faces or, face prints on file. And then a list of possible matches comes up. With fingerprints, it's a forensic fingerprint expert who takes a look and says whether or not there's a match. There's no such thing as a certified forensic face expert in the US. We've never certified that. So these are individuals, often it's the officer who's investigating the crime who's running his own search. He might be really, really bad at performing this job. It is a forensic science, but we don't require experts. We don't require forensic experts. To make matters worse, we allow photo editing. We would never allow a fingerprint expert to draw the missing part of a fingerprint before running the search. And yet we, in half a dozen jurisdictions that we've surveyed, they allow forensic sketches to be submitted to the face recognition systems. They cut and paste eyes from somebody else's photograph into the suspect photograph before running it a search. Again, you can't cut and paste someone else's fingerprint data into your fingerprint. You're contaminating your biometric sample. So there are a lot of issues when we start looking at face recognition as it's used in practice, which is as a forensic science. But we've sort of ignored that, and we treat it very much, or law enforcement treats it a lot like magic or like an art. And that doesn't belong in an investigation. So I applaud any effort to make it a more reliable, more sort of controlled search, but I think we're very, very far from that. And as a consequence, we are going to see more individuals like Robert Williams, like Michael Oliver, being misidentified because we're playing art and magic with what should be considered a forensic science.
We have an audience question that's come in. DPD claims that only still images are fed into the system. Does it matter if the tech is live or from a still? That's a great question. Who wants to take it?
I can definitely let Claire take that one, even though I know the answer, but I learned it from Claire.
So there's a difference. With live with live face recognition, so running face recognition off of video feeds, what you're doing is you're taking templates of every single person walking by the camera and comparing that against the database. So maybe a database of people suspected of carjacking or something like that. Misidentification rates are going to be very, very high. What is so concerning about this is biometric surveillance. You can surveil a protest and law enforcement can figure out everybody who's there. You can watch somebody across time, basically identifying where they go, who they talk to. So that's a very, very risky, very authoritarian, let's be honest, type of a system. So what's the difference between that and still images? Still images, you do have to identify who you want to run first. So there is somewhat of a limiting factor, but I would urge caution to say that they're not totally different. It's a bit of a sliding scale. You can take hundreds and hundreds of still images from video, run them against your face recognition system, and still be able to identify everybody at a protest. It all depends on who you're actually looking for. Are you looking for everybody to just try to identify as many people as possible? Or are you looking for a particular person who you've caught on camera committing a crime? That's one of the key differences I would draw. Another is accuracy, but again, it's a little bit of a sliding scale. Video stills, our video camera systems are pretty old, and the cameras are often not set at a good place to capture good quality images. As we all know, walking around, cameras are usually above our heads. So they're going to catch like really great forehead shots of all of us. And if we're wearing a baseball cap, probably not a good image at all. Still photography in some circumstances, like a tourist taking cell phone videos or cell phone photos, those might be of higher quality. But again, there's as much variability in photography as there as in videography. So there are differences, and we talk about them sort of as being sort of different systems. One's a surveillance system, one's an investigative system, but the line between the two is pretty blurry.
And I like to add something too, is that we didn't get there, like Claire said earlier, DPD didn't just decide to move to still images. When they signed the contract with DataWorks Plus, they wanted real-time tracking from drones, from surveillance helicopters, from unlimited mobile devices, from any camera, from Project Greenlight. So they really did aim to real-time surveil people as they walk through the community. It took over a year of activism to get them to have a stricter policy. So I just want to be clear, like right now, there's a lot of promoting this strong policy that they have in place as if they came to this, on their own whim without massive resistance. And so, it's important to know that they built out this real-time crime surveillance program with the intent to real-time surveil the public.
The other thing I just mentioned on the policy, it's worth mentioning that there is a policy, and relative to other policies that exist in the United States, it's a pretty strong one. I'm not saying it's the best, but relatively strong. It has a limitation on what crimes can be investigated using face recognition. But if you look at, I do get a bit worried about that, because if you look at DPD now also puts out statistics every month on the crimes that they have used face recognition, and they don't actually match up to the policy. So they're still investigating crimes that under the policy, they're actually not really supposed to investigate. So I do get worried that yes, it's a policy, but because it's not externally imposed or externally sort of governed or imposed on DPD, it's a little more flexible than it maybe than would be ideal.
Thank you for my next column idea, Claire. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about the way people feel about facial recognition is it does seem like there is an opportunity to get better legislation, because it's something that people on the left who are concerned about bias and invasion of privacy and justice are concerned about, but it's also something people on the right who are opposed to government interference, over governance, government intrusion are also opposed to. And it seems like there's an opportunity for better legislation and regulation. And we've even seen bipartisan interest in our own legislature. So I think it's always good to encourage anyone who's watching to reach out to your lawmakers. If you live in the city of Detroit, to your council members, to your state reps and state senators. If you don't live in the city of Detroit, to your state reps and state senators, and to your own local law enforcement departments and city councils. Because, this is the sort of thing that gets pioneered in a large city like Detroit, but, it doesn't mean that your city isn't going to adopt it down the road. So, but yeah, I think if anywhere in Michigan or anywhere in the country, if you're listening to this, call your lawmakers and tell them how you feel about it, because they listen. They may not always care, but they listen, and they know they hear a groundswell. Then most of them are going to respond in some way. So that's I'm a big fan of the Call Your Lawmaker platform.
And they don't have to issue any new there's legislation out there that's been bipartisan legislation that's been put forward that's just kind of sitting.
Yeah.
And so they could rejuvenate.
They could, yeah. So this is a good time. Our new legislature is seated in January in Michigan, so this is a good idea. It's a good time. January is a good time to call up and say, "Hey, here are my priorities. I vote. I'm active, and here's what I want you to work on." We've talked a lot about the facial recognition in law enforcement part. It's something all of us work on and have an interest in. But in coded bias, a lot of they were talking about the whole broad spectrum of how algorithms and that are inherently flawed in their construction are used to dictate all parts of our lives. And I was thinking about the way that algorithms determine our credit, another opaque system that we have no role into, and it can makes it a lot more expensive to be poor if you're considered a risk when it comes to either getting credit or accessing credit or even getting car insurance. That there's all this just sort of other host of things that are really not accessible to our input. Do either one of you want to weigh in on how we can make any kind of headway on those fronts?
Yeah, there are a lot of efforts. There are a lot of organizations out there, Data for Black Lives, Media Justice, Fight for the Future. There are a lot of organizations out there that are, and I'm going to miss some, and I love you all, but that are working on trying to make these systems much more equitable. And that is something that we saw through our data bodies, was that community members across the spectrum were saying, like, if I make a mistake, that 15 minutes of my life where I couldn't pay my bills has now followed me for the duration of my life, and I'm unable to pull myself out of this rut. Or if I can't pay my water bill, and now my home's been condemned, and now it's difficult for me to get another place to live. Or so then these systems integrate with each other, and they've already made up their mind that you're not a viable human being worthy of investment. And so I'll also lift up that I co-authored with the several organizations and the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy, centering racial equity throughout data integration, which is a toolkit that is very helpful in thinking about how you can start to walk back some of these policies that are really keeping the most impoverished of the community in deep poverty, because it is saying that, hey, once you're in poverty and you've made those mistakes, you're not somebody that we're going to give any kind of resource and support to. And we're going to tell all our friends and all these other institutions not to give you any support or resources as well. And that's kind of the way the system works, and it is perpetually violent in that way.
Actually, if I can overshare a little bit, I have inexplicably bad credit. I have no idea why it's bad. I get these little Experian notes, and I just was informed that between like October 20th and November 15th or something like that, my credit fell 15 points. Why? I don't know. I didn't do anything, but it fell 15 points. And I'm a college educated professional person with a middle class income and a computer that I can sit at and try to understand this stuff. And I have no ability to influence any of it. So it is a deep mystery, and it certainly makes my life a lot more expensive to have inexplicably bad credit. But yes, it's what you're saying is that this system has decided that I am questionable, and so any little change in my life, it flags as cause for alarm and cause to drop my credit. It's very strange. I don't care for it.
Just on that point, we do have the Fair Credit Reporting Act, so you are entitled to information about what your credit score is, what decisions have made into that, and then to correct any incorrect data that is a part of that.
Their data is all correct. They've just decided it's alarming in some way. I'm not really, but thank you. But yes, but other people, that may be helpful. It's just sort of the Job situation I find myself in. But I think we should, I want to take a step back into, kind of the thing that started Coded Bias, which was, I thought, such a really interesting and powerful moment, which was when the MIT researcher Joy Buolamwini tried to make a mirror kind of for like a fun kind of class project that could recognize her face and give messages cued to her, in the morning when she looked into it. And it couldn't recognize her face. And she's Dr. Buolamwini's Black woman. And I thought that was, I can't stop thinking about that part of the movie and how powerful, in a negative way, your face is not recognized as a face, and that's a thing that's was embedded in this technology. I found that, just a haunting moment from the movie. And I just wonder if either one of you, that stuck out to you, and what that said to you about the flaws embedded in this whole, and the bias, and just the unfairness embedded in this work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it struck me as this kind of continuation of a very harmful legacy of not seeing darker skinned people as fully human, right? And and if you think back on, I'll tie that, how I was feeling about that when I learned about Joy's work, back to when I was reading about Simone Brown's work with Dark Matters, and Project Greenlight was rolled out into the city, right? And these aren't new phenomenons. Simone Brown talks about the 18th century lantern laws, where if you were a Black person and you weren't in the presence of a white person, you had to carry a lit lantern in front of your forehead so that you could be seen. And so these sorts of technologies that are dehumanizing or don't recognize you as fully human, or that make sure that you are hyper visible so that, other demographics can feel safe in your presence, is a long, long history of this particular way of containing particular communities. And so that is how I felt when I learned about that research.
It's literal erasure to say your face doesn't qualify as a face. It's really harmful. It's harmful and just degrading in a way that shouldn't be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot about something that Tawana says, which is the difference between being seen and being watched. And I think about that a lot, both now in my work with face recognition and at the end of Joy's research, and also looking back at the history of photography in general. The photography was designed to take good, well-lit, quality photos of white people. There was the Shirley cards. The Shirley cards were the cards that was the photograph that you tested your sort of chemical composition when you're developing film. It was always a white woman. The only reason why they started expanding beyond taking good quality images of people who look like me were because furniture manufacturers were complaining that their customers didn't like that the photos of furniture didn't match what they would get in the mail, the furniture that they would get. So we actually didn't even correct the problem of photography only capturing white skin for dark skin. We corrected it for furniture. And this happened in like the 80s. This is a this has been exactly how photography has developed. So the fact that we are building AI systems onto photography, it should be completely unsurprising to all of us that there is this bias. The other thing it makes me think of is I used to work in human rights, and this right to an identity versus the right against being surveilled. And I just wrote a paper on this that will be published next year, looking at there are about 1 billion people in the world that can't prove their identity, and that means they're not eligible for benefits, for government aid. If they leave the country, they might not be guaranteed back into their own country, that type of thing. So the UN Development Program is very much pushing the idea of an identity for all. We're quickly moving towards a biometric identity for all, and I do worry that in an effort to get everybody the right to an identity, the right to be seen, for access to aid and for access to a living, access to prove their citizenship, we are very quickly moving quite quickly past that to the ability to surveil each and every one of these people. So this is something that's very much happening now, and it should be part of every single conversation we have about identity, surveillance systems, across the entire world.
We have another great audience question. From the legal perspective, to what extent have these systems been challenged in the courts, especially federal, and how are the courts interpreting system use from a right to privacy lens?
So my research focuses almost entirely on law enforcement use of face recognition, and to date that has not been challenged in federal court. The only case that we have really seen it challenged in court is in a case, Willie Lynch versus the state of Florida. Willie Lynch is a Black man. He's serving an 8-year sentence for selling $50 worth of crack cocaine to undercover officers. Face recognition was used to identify him, and he was not given access to the information about the search. The face recognition system actually turned up 5 possible matches, of which he was just one of them. And he said, hey, your system says there were 4 other suspects. I want to use that to say it might have been somebody else who did the crime. Here's what the appellate court said. Willie Lynch is not entitled to those other 4 images because he can't prove that they look like the suspect. Well, how in God's name is he supposed to tell the court what the photos look like before having access to view the photos? That is literally the only legal ruling in any way, shape, or form that we have on the use of face recognition in U.S. courts. There are a number of cases against biometric use by private companies in Illinois under the Biometric Information Privacy Act. Clearview AI, the company I mentioned before that scraped all of our photos off the internet and made it into a face recognition database, they're being sued in Illinois, in New York, and by the state of Vermont for their setting up of a face recognition system. But that's about it. Encouragingly, Coded Bias talks a lot about what happened, the fight against face surveillance in the UK. There was recently a case, Ed Bridges case in the UK, where the court actually found that the face surveillance system that the South Wales police had established did violate the right of citizens' privacy. And in the absence of rules, of basically laws saying that they can perform exactly that type of surveillance, that it was unlawful. So this is very, very encouraging, certainly for the UK. And I sincerely hope that US courts take this up in a similar fashion. I'm not terribly optimistic, but we do have that UK ruling.
Well, how important is passing legislation to govern this use to the ability to file suit over it?
Super important. Yeah, right now we would have to rely on constitutional rights predominantly and rights under existing laws. I think they absolutely exist. I think the use of face recognition in a criminal case where the defendant does not have access to information about that search violates the Fifth Amendment, your right to a fair trial. And I think that's something that someone could argue, but constitutional claims are much harder than a claim that says you violated this face recognition law that said you must disclose this information or you cannot use it if you didn't have reasonable suspicion to believe I'd committed a crime. So yeah, super vital. Legislation's probably the way to go.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add one more thing is like we look at the case of Michael Oliver in Detroit. He didn't learn what image they were used until he was sitting in court. And once when he saw the image, he's like, "That's not even me." And the judge saw the image and went, "That isn't you." And that's how, like, so he lost his job, lost his the place he was living, lost his vehicles, because he all of this incarceration and his job not believing that he wasn't the person, and he had been due to come off parole for a nonviolent situation that, another case where he just wasn't in the right place at the really bad luck. But neither here nor there, his parole was extended for a year. Like all of these things happened despite the fact that it was proven that he was not the person identified on face recognition. And I'll just add that now that a lot of law enforcement agencies know that activists are pushing back and they're being less transparent about which cases they're applying face recognition to. And so you're going to have really strong oversight. You're going to have really strong, a prosecutor who's going to really hold their feet to the fire and say, like, how did you come about accusing this defendant? Because if they don't ask those questions and they don't have that oversight, defense attorneys have no way of knowing how their clients are being identified using this technology. And so you won't have a fair representation in the court system at all.
One of the things, to kind of go back to the beginning, I think we're coming to the end of our hour here, from the movie is when Joy Buolamwini started doing the research into how this technology didn't answer her face or didn't recognize her face, she started looking into how this machine had been taught to recognize faces, and that it was images of white men who had instructed the computer to recognize faces. Tech is sort of a notoriously white man field. One of the things I thought was so awesome about this movie is that all of the tech people, the futurists, the scientists, mostly activists, was almost all women. And I loved seeing that in this movie. I love being here with a panel of female experts on this subject tonight. But it seems like, we all bring our bias with us, and we have, for too often, we default to like the cisgender, heterosexual, white male Christian experience as sort of this blank slate norm, and that any identity you have that's not that means that you are biased, but that there's this sort of perfect truth here that no one asked John Roberts if he can be impartial in his Supreme Court confirmation hearings in the way that Sonia Sotomayor was questioned about whether she could be impartial. And now we have this sort of enshrined in tech, which we view as somehow even more objective than a human could be, even though it's built by humans. I think it seems vitally important that we continue to build the numbers of women and non-binary and Black, brown, people of color in this field. What are things that those of us who don't work in tech, that don't have, what can we do to support this? The diversification of tech.
Well, you just did. I mean, you're a journalist with a pretty hefty platform, and the fact that you just said what you just said goes tremendously a long way in changing the narrative. I grew up in a city. You know what Detroit's dominant narrative has been for the last 50 years. And if you grow up in a circumstance where the world sees where you live in a particular way, it's really challenging to get folks to buy into helping you resist these types of systems. And so we not only do we need the voices of the tech, the folks in tech and data science and AI ethicists, et cetera, to be more diversified, but we also need the voices of the people who are experiencing these systems to have a platform to be heard as well. And so I think it's unfortunate that it took really misidentification cases of people who were falsely incarcerated for it to be to amplify those particular voices into the mainstream. And so, yeah, I think I want to be clear that diversifying the tech field is just one step of it, right? The law enforcement and government institutions have this baked in bias because of the way these systems came about, that making a perfect algorithm for face recognition is not going to create a better livelihood for Black, Brown, Indigenous, and even poor white community members. And so, yeah, that was a lot to crunch in there, but that's my opinion.
No, I think that's totally right. I don't have too much to add beyond also looking at, what Tawana said about using platforms to amplify voices that we don't typically hear. I think is super important. I get caught in this on Twitter. I find myself retweeting or tweeting out articles that are predominantly written by white men. And it's just because of the outlets that I read. And so to diversify where you're actually going for information instead of the usual suspects, instead of what other people are advocating for or amplifying on Twitter, think of like, is this an echo chamber? Are we actually perpetuating the assumed knowledge superiority of certain people based on the fact that we have these ancient institutions that have historically amplified those voices? And then I think what Tawana said at the end as well is there's another bias baked into the system that directly speaks to the face recognition and criminal investigations issue, and that's the criminality of young Black men in particular. And I think the Michael Oliver case is such a good example of this. Michael Oliver and the suspect that was caught on camera looked nothing alike. They have different complexions. They have completely different facial structures. Michael Oliver has tons of tattoos, and the guy in the video has no tattoos. There is nothing that makes them look similar except that they're both young Black men. And this assumption of criminality, we just have to take an honest look at, and we should not bake and build technology on top of that for a few reasons. One is that we're always going to be using historical data. Who has historically been a criminal in the United States is people who've been arrested, young Black men. So if we assume that, then we're just going to continue perpetuating that bias. So yes, we absolutely have to look at the biases that exist on the one side of the spectrum in the tech space, but we absolutely have to look at the other side in how our criminal legal system operates.
Yeah, thank you. That is an excellent expansion on the question I asked. That's why I'm glad to be on a panel with such smart women, is because you're making me a better moderator. So yeah, one of my favorite tech stories, and if this is apocryphal, don't tell me because I'll be crushed, is that, Apple has on the iPhone, on its health app, they now have a menstrual cycle tracker, but that in the first several iterations, they didn't have that because the team developing this health app were all men. And so something that has value or potentially has value to women from as young as, 11, 12 to in their 50s is something that a huge chunk of half the population has. This is an extremely relevant health function, but instead we have step counters and all kinds of ways to interface, like your weight from your doctor's office, but this was left off the table because there was no woman literally at the table to say, hey, we have a thing. And like I said, if this isn't a true story, I'll be crushed, because it's, to me, such a great illustration of what gets left out of the conversation and the functionality when you have a homogenous room. So I think that we are at the end of our time here together. And so I'm going to ask each of you if you want to say something in closing, just to close us out here. Whoever would like to go first. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I'm really grateful that No one listening could have enjoyed it more than I did. So I'm grateful to have been here with you tonight.
I'll just say that a lot of Detroiters, like I said, they're pushing to hopefully get some protections in the charter coming up, which would not just protect Detroiters, but would protect the state of Michigan and possibly model for the rest of the world how you institutionalize, humanity and human rights and civil liberties. But we also have a grassroots campaign called Green Chairs, Not Green Lights. And it really is asking community members come back to the front porches and look out the windows and see each other, not watch each other. Stop reporting on everyone. Stop. We've created a culture of surveillance outside of policing that is very dangerous to how we see how we're tracking and targeting one another. And so we have to start getting back to the sort of village mentality where we care if folks don't have water, where we care if folks don't have enough to eat. If we care, if the pandemic hasn't taught us anything, it should have taught us that we need each other. And I'll also say that we really need to stay very clear on how rapidly the pandemic is being used to expand surveillance and ask deeper questions about these tools like face recognition thermometers that are making their way through schools and all these other sorts of technologies the crisis has been utilized as an opportunity for tech companies to kind of ramp up their data extraction and biometric surveillance. And those are things we need to ask deeper questions about and challenge when we see them happening.
And I'll just add to that. It sounds cliche, but it is not. That doesn't mean it's wrong. You have power. The legislature belongs to you. They're supposed to represent you. Law enforcement is to protect and serve communities. Guess who's part of the community? It's you. I've been so inspired and blown away listening very quietly in on Detroit City Council meetings where dozens and dozens of Detroiters call in and say, this is what I care about. This is what I think you should do. And yes, while ultimately the Detroit City Council decided to renew the face recognition contract, much to in complete opposition of every single one of those comments, it is because of community members that there is now that robust policy and that this is now part of the public dialogue. You also have the right to information about this type of thing. I know as much as I do about face recognition in the US because I submit public records requests. You don't have to be a lawyer to do this. You don't have to be a journalist to do this. You can be anyone. You can be a high school student. You can just be, you have the right to information about how your tax dollars are spent and how technology and whatever else is being used on you. So file public records requests. And then the last thing I'll say is I think the idea that, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, that's persuasive sometimes. And it's like, oh yeah, surveillance is you're not surveilling me or you're surveilling me incidentally because you're looking for crime to keep me safe. And I would just caution that represents a very privileged position and a fundamental assumption that all laws are just and all laws are enforced justly. And I think if we look at certainly the last year, of public protest and conversation around policing in the United States, but we can look back as far as you want. That's not true. And the power to change unjust laws or laws that are enforced unjustly is in the hands of all of us. And so I just caution everybody to become complicit in or lulled into a sense of I'm not doing anything wrong, so I don't have to worry about these things. And watch Coded Bias because it's an amazing film.
All right. This has been a really outstanding conversation. Like I said, I'm really grateful to have been your moderator tonight. It's been just an honor and a privilege to be with you guys. I want to remind audience members about a couple of other virtual free film festival films that are coming up. Waging Change, disadvantaged restaurant workers around the country come together to demand respect and one fair wage. Breed and Bootleg of Flint Rap Legends, this documentary about the underappreciated legacy of hip hop in Flint. A Woman's Work, the NFL's Cheerleader Problem. Football and Feminism Collide in this documentary that follows former NFL cheerleaders battling the league to end wage theft and illegal employment practices that have persisted for 50 years. And the final, excitingly named Dope, Hookers, and Pavement, the real and imagined history of Detroit hardcore, an account of the early days of the Detroit hardcore punk scene circa 1981, 1982, and the notorious Cass Corridor. You can find out about more of those at prefilmfestival.com. I should have had that ready. Somebody quickly correct me if that is not the right URL. And I thank everyone for participating tonight. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching. Thanks for, you can do, if you want to stay informed about this issue, you can not do any better than following Tawana and Clare's work. They are creating this field of pushback and monitoring this sort of technology. They're on the front lines of this work. And so follow these guys on Twitter, follow their academic and activism work respectively. And and thank you guys so much.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Appreciate you. Bye, everybody.